I have permission from the president of the school to do a little bit of self-promotion here at DSPT. You may have noticed as you've been wandering around the last couple of days that we do have an exhibition here in Blackfriars Gallery that is part of the 800th anniversary celebration, and I want to encourage you to take some time both to look at the pieces of art that are here, but also what we're calling the storyboard, which gives you a little bit of the background of the exhibition, because it actually directly relates to a lot of the points or topics that were raised in the first panel. The exhibition is literally the fruit of a group that was known in Sussex, England, as the Guild of St. Joseph and St. Dominic, which in turn was the result of work and influence by Father Vincent McNabb, who in turn was influenced by Rerum Novarum. And he, along with G.K. Chesterton and a few others, began a movement that was known for a while as distributism. And long story short, this exhibition is related to that. So I do encourage you to just read the story of the exhibition and how it relates to our role as a Dominican order in, at various times, cultural movements that in turn lead to expression in artistic ways. That having been said, I would like to follow the format that Sister Marianne adopted this morning and introduce all three of our panelists at once and then give the freedom to just come forward one by one. We have this morning with us Bill Cox, who will address topics related to the church as an agent in our culture. Bill Cox is president and CEO of the Alliance of Catholic Healthcare and founder of the Ministry Leadership Center. We will have Barbara Elliott address us on charitable ministries. She's founder and president of the Center for Cultural Renewal, and she also teaches at the Honors College of Houston Baptist University. And then we will have Greg Tarczynski, who perhaps I would say first and foremost is a DSPT alum, and is also a photographer for Catholic News Service and vice president of Retail Consulting and Analytics. So please join me in welcoming all three of our panelists this morning.
Good morning. Somewhat like Anishka's presentation yesterday, my presentation is going to be very practical in terms of our engagement with faith and society. And I want to speak from the perspective of Catholic healthcare, because one of the important ways in which the church is an evangelizing agent in our culture is through its extensive network of Catholic healthcare, Catholic hospitals, Catholic nursing homes, other Catholic healthcare services. For example, here in the Western United States, we provide 60% of the acute care in Alaska, 40% of the acute care in Washington State, over 13% in California, and we have a substantial presence in Oregon, Montana, Nevada, Arizona, and Texas. So these are critically important institutions for the church. And this morning I want to address two areas where we intersect with faith and are an agent of change in terms of culture. And the first one is in the area of ministry leadership formation. In 2002, the Alliance of Catholic Healthcare, my organization, and the California Catholic Conference, Ned DeLussey's organization, convened the bishops of California and our Catholic healthcare leaders for a conference in Palo Alto to examine the challenges facing Catholic healthcare and what we might do together as Episcopal leaders and healthcare leaders to address those challenges. And one of the challenges that became an immediate priority was the urgent need to design and implement a ministry formation program for the senior leaders in our Catholic healthcare organizations. And this was necessitated by two developments. First, the fact that ever fewer women religious, the founders and the culture bearers of the Catholic mission in healthcare, were available to serve in management, governance, and sponsorship. When I joined the Catholic Health Association in 1980, 65% of Catholic hospitals were administered by a woman religious. Today, not one is in the United States, and that's across over 600 institutions across the United States. Second, while lay leaders in Catholic healthcare were technically competent, often amazingly so, for the most part, they had no deep grounding in how to operate their hospitals as church ministries. And if something wasn't done to address this situation, our systems and hospitals would inevitably lose their Catholic mooring over time and become secular entities, just gravitate into secular entities with little or no connection with the church. So the bishops and healthcare leaders back in 2002 established a work group that met monthly during the next year to outline the dimensions of what lay ministry formation should encompass. We were starting de novo. We had no idea at the outset what this would entail. We did early on determine that if formation in mission and ministry was important, it had to be something more than a weekend program in personal uplifting experience. So we decided right at the outset that we had a lot to do in terms of formation, and our formation program would be a 3-year program for all senior leaders in Catholic healthcare. The first pushback came from a woman religious who said, "Oh, we can't take these very important senior executives out of Catholic healthcare because they have so much to do within their institutions." And our pushback on that was, if you don't, you're not going to have Catholic healthcare. So we're going to have to do both, and these senior executives are going to have to do both. And the most effective corporations and organizations in the United States are those that have a clear sense of mission and whose leaders understand the mission of the organization. So this became an imperative. And it became known as the Ministry Leadership Center. I appreciate being identified as the founder of the Ministry Leadership Center, but I'm not. I was just one of the animators at the outset of this. We had many, many really qualified people, including Ned, involved in the development. So in 2003, the healthcare leaders and the bishops accepted the plan, and the healthcare system CEOs agreed to fund it. And the funding wasn't inexpensive. We were talking several millions of dollars a year to do this well. A theologian with extensive healthcare experience was hired to lead it, recruit the center's staff and faculty, and flesh out its program. The center, over time, the center developed a curriculum that invites its participants to explore the culture of Catholic healthcare through 12 foundational concerns, beginning with vocation. That is, work in Catholic healthcare is not just a job, it's a calling. The second foundational concern is heritage. The very rich heritage we derived largely from the women religious who founded these institutions. The third was spirituality, and the late Andre Delbecq headed that section up, one of the fellows here at the Dominican School. Did an incredible job. Then we did response to suffering, values integration, Catholic social teaching, clinical ethics, discernment, organizational ethics, care for the poor, whole person care, and collaboration with church authorities. Every 3-year cohort ended with a bishop sitting with these senior healthcare executives, many of whom had never seen a bishop. And we had the bishop talk about the challenges he's facing in his diocese, his perception of Catholic healthcare, and they had a vigorous engagement in every single one of them. It was good for the bishops, and it was good for the healthcare leaders. Between 2004 and 2016, the Ministry Leadership Center formed more than 1,000 Catholic healthcare executives in mission and ministry. The participants learned how to integrate the 12 foundational concerns into their personal and professional lives. This wasn't just about creating better leaders for Catholic healthcare. It was about enabling people to become better people through an examination of the key elements of the Catholic tradition. And they not only had to integrate it into their personal lives, they had to learn how to articulate it back, and they had to learn how, in these programs, to incorporate it into the operations of their hospitals and health systems. So it got very, very practical as well. It is hard to overestimate the impact that this has had on people's lives and on our ministry. When you would go to the final session after 3 years and ask the participants in this formation program what was the principal thing that meant so much to you in this program, or what did you think of it, they would just almost universally say, I can't believe my healthcare system made this opportunity available to me. It has made a huge difference in my life. And then we began to see the differences back in our systems too, when they put their budgets together, when they designed programs for their communities. All of these Catholic principles came to bear on how they accomplished their work. The program became so successful, as a matter of fact, that the Hilton Foundation gave it a $1 million grant to determine how it could be adapted to other institutional ministries in the church, such as Catholic Charities, Catholic Relief Services, and, quite frankly, Catholic higher education. So that is one way in which, in a very practical way, faith is making a difference and making a difference in our culture. I had a friend, just to tell a story, I was invited to a barbecue years ago, and a Jewish family was present at this barbecue, and this Jewish fellow who taught at George Mason University saw me and knew I worked in Catholic healthcare, and he said, I need to talk to you about an experience we had. And I thought, oh my gosh, what's coming now? And he said, we took our family up to Anchorage, and then we went out into the bush. I wanted to take them out into the bush in Alaska. And my youngest daughter, got very sick and had to be medevaced back to Anchorage. And the big institution there is Providence Hospital, a beautiful place. And he said, we walked in, Bill, and I saw these crucifixes. And I turned to my wife and said, we're in trouble now. He said, when we left, our experience, the way we were treated, the way my daughter was cared for, the way the staff responded to our family was incredible. And he said, I just want you to know that. It was an incredible experience. So this man looked at the cross before his experience there as an obstacle. When he left, it was no longer an obstacle. And I think that's very much, without proselytizing, a form of evangelization. In October 2015, the Alliance of Catholic Healthcare and the California Catholic Conference convened the bishops. We do this periodically every several years, this time in Burbank. And a critical issue facing these leaders was California's recent legalization of physician-assisted suicide and what they might do together to respond to it. The leaders established a working group comprised of bishops, physicians, healthcare, and diocesan leaders to develop and recommend an appropriate and effective response. As it conducted its work, the leadership group noted the following. First, public opinion polls almost universally show that upwards of 65% of U.S. voters now support legalizing physician-assisted suicide. Second, they noted a 2015 National Institute of Medicine study that revealed that the experience of dying in the United States is often characterized by fragmented care, inadequate treatment of distressing symptoms, frequent transitions among care settings, and enormous care responsibilities for families. According to this report, the current healthcare system of rendering more intensive services than are necessary and desired by patients, and the lack of coordination among programs increases risks to patients and creates avoidable burdens on them and their families. Third, the group noted that nearly every one of them knew or has heard of someone who has died badly while receiving sophisticated and expensive life-sustaining treatments in hospitals or nursing homes. Many of these people endured their final days in pain, feeling undignified and a burden to others, and their loved ones often felt lost and confused, not knowing how to get through each day or how to plan for the future. Worse still was the realization later on that much of this suffering was unnecessary. It is not surprising then, looking at these things, that fearing the possibility of dying badly in a healthcare facility, the public increasingly believes terminally ill patients should have the legal option of ending their lives. Fourth, the group noted that advances in treating disease have multiplied both the complexity and duration of family caregiving. The studies have shown that many of the people who go through this experience, especially with someone in an ICU, the after effects are similar to what we call PTSD, and I've seen this in a couple of my friends who have experienced this. The economic impact is enormous, and so it's debilitating to families as well. So the leadership group concluded that a transformation is clearly needed in the way society, not merely our healthcare system, cares for seriously ill people and supports family caregivers. The group also further concluded that the need to transform the way in which society cares for the terminally ill and supports their families requires urgent and decisive action on the part of the church. Accordingly, they recommended that the bishops and healthcare leaders focus their collective energies during the next 5 years on implementing a robust whole person care initiative to ensure that their parishioners, their patients are loved and supported, can openly talk with their spiritual leaders, clinicians, and family members about their wishes at the end of life, and have access to quality palliative care before they suffer needless medical procedures. The bishops and the healthcare leaders adopted this program on October 19th of last year, along with the following aspirational statement. As church and Catholic healthcare leaders in California, they said, we believe that physician-assisted suicide, while legal, is not yet an entrenched cultural or clinical reality. Recognizing this, we are committed to developing together and in collaboration with other leaders in the palliative care field, a medical and pastoral approach to care through the end of life that provides a dignified, compassionate, and loving alternative to assisted suicide for seriously ill people and their families. Our intent is to create a church and Catholic healthcare collaborative model that serves our California parishioners and patients well, and that can be replicated by the church and Catholic healthcare leaders in other states. The California bishops and healthcare leaders believe that by caring well for the frailest and most vulnerable in their dioceses, parishes, and healthcare facilities, they can improve care for many people now and in the years to come. They can make clear that the best care possible not only includes excellent disease treatments, but also concern for a person's physical comfort and emotional and spiritual well-being. And they can raise broader cultural expectations about the kind of end-of-life care people need, people deserve, and people should be demanding. In so doing, they believe they can protect the breadth of our human endowment in ways that will be felt long into the future, and that the healthiest response to death is to love, honor, and celebrate life. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you, all of the organizers here, for including me in this. I haven't been back to the DSPT for a few years, and it really is a joy to be able to be with you and learn from you. I'm having a little bit of cultural whiplash right now in that my primary energies have been going into having Socratic discussions with undergraduates about great texts from the ancient Greeks and Romans and medieval period, et cetera. On the other hand, I have had one foot in the nonprofit charitable sector for about 25 years now, so I'm kind of shifting weight from one to the other, but I find that they do converge. The disciplines of one can apply to the other. I started my career with an academic phase of it and then moved to public policy, went to Washington, concluded that perhaps government doesn't have all the answers, then an international chapter of reporting about events in Europe up to the time of the fall of the wall, entered a charitable sector there, then writing, 5 books later resurfaced, moved back to the United States and began this journey kind of in 2 places, one in the inner city and the other in the academy. Interesting, that's all I can say. God had a really unanticipated plan for me. When I came back to the States in '95, I was praying, Lord, what next? I have 2 kids to support, and it's a little unclear where I'm supposed to land. And he said very specifically to answer, I don't always get these answers like this, but this was very clear. Go into the inner cities of America, find the people doing my work, write about them, speak about them, be their friend, be their advocate, and be a bridge between the people who have resources and those who need them. And I'm thinking to myself, right, Barbara in the hood. I mean, it's not my natural habitat, but I have had such an incredible ride since, finding these unsung heroes, the street saints, the people who are doing the difficult job of scooping up human beings and loving them into wholeness. And along the way, I was given the opportunity to help nurture their strength, find out what it is they're doing, why does it work, can you document their success, plant models that then work. So putting these disciplines together, I'm looking at charity, but also with an eye to the historical roots and to the theological roots and to the practical effects, social entrepreneurism. There have been several mentors along the way who I think are kind of the gold standard in finding a way into this field. One of them was Marvin Olasky. He wrote a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, and he was quite rigorous in finding out exactly what was it that Americans were doing at the time of the founding. What was it that Americans were doing and caring for one another at the time that de Tocqueville visited America, for example. And he found hundreds and hundreds of little thriving, what Tocqueville called private voluntary associations, to care for everything from widows to orphans to what he delicately called women of fallen honor. You get the idea. Anyway, children, people who were in poverty, whatever it might be. And wherever there was a community, there were people who were helping extend a hand, but not to give a handout, but to give what Marvin Olasky then dubbed a hand up. And he was saying that we have essentially abandoned part of the initial mission in that we have asked too little of those who are providing charitable care. He's saying that the initial Americans, after the founding here, had a category of what they called the worthy poor. This was not somebody who was simply a drunk lounging in the town square expecting a handout. These were people who had a hardship and for a time needed to be lifted up. Well, Olasky then applied this to what we were doing in America now, and he sat me down and gave me a tutorial at his needs and then said, "Go forth, my child, and write." The watchword for him was effective compassion. Is an organization doing enough to actually transform the life of the person that they are serving? Because if they're not, it's not enough. We're not asking enough of the recipient to participate in their own rehabilitation, the object being to lift them to their feet and then let them go and be self-sufficient or active and productive people in the community. The second mentor that I had who made an imprint was Peter Drucker. And he had a category of establishing whether or not a nonprofit would be effective by taking them through 5 simple questions. Most of you know about Peter Drucker, I'm guessing, at least people in the business community, but he asked the same questions of nonprofits. What is your mission? Who do you serve? What do those people value? How do you evaluate your results? And what's your plan? And I've now taken lots and lots and lots of nonprofits through that, and it's extraordinary what unfolds along the way to clarify a mission and to try to run nonprofits a little bit more like businesses in the sense that there is accountability. The profit motive is different, but if the end is transformed human lives, that is a commodity, and you can actually see the health of people coming through on the other side. Along the way, I discovered that there is a spectrum of faith-based organizations, everything from faith-founded, and then it becomes faith-silent. That would apply to most of the universities from the time of the founding in this country. Then there's the faith-optional model. You know, you can go to chapel on Wednesday if you want to, but you don't have to. Then there's the faith-integrated model, which is you have to have a certain number of credits of theology and philosophy before we let you out of here, but what you do with it is your own business. And then there is the faith-saturated model. And for a nonprofit, that means you are going to hear about Jesus Christ every day. You are going to have people praying for you and with you. And our goal for you will be to not have not only your material needs met, but your spiritual needs as well. Now that's getting to be risky business. But I also found that the people who take the faith-saturated approach were producing more actually transformed people than the other models were. So if you take this approach into the inner city, you can see a whole variety of attempts to alleviate poverty, going all the way back, well, I don't know where you want to pick it in history. You can pick the communist model, you can pick the Great Society, you can pick effective compassion in the Bush administration. The real important question underlying these is that they are built on competing views of man. If you attempt to only solve the material problem, you are assuming that man is only material and that that will meet all that's necessary. If, on the other hand, you believe that man is a spiritual being, any remedy for a malady would have to take that into account, maybe even focus on that above other things. In other words, I found the same thing from academic analysis that I found from one of the street saints. Freddie Garcia had a ministry in San Antonio. He was a former heroin addict himself, and then later ran a center to help other people leave drugs. He said, quite provocatively, but he could get away with it because of his history, he said, the problem is not drugs. He said, drugs are the symptom. Sin is the problem, and Jesus Christ is the answer. Well, that's bold stuff. On the other hand, 90% of the people who came to his center emerged a year later transformed human beings. So something seemed to be going on in terms of the spirit. One of the major discoveries I made along the way is that the at-risk population in the inner city has multiple obstacles. It's not just a lack of money. That would be far too easy. There is a total breakdown of the institutions that should equip youngsters for life. The family has fallen into disrepair, and the presence of faith in those places has proven to have an effect, but not enough to overcome all of the other obstacles, education. So the mediators of civilization, if you will, have proven to be more and more scarce. So you go into the inner city today, 72% of the children born to African American mothers are being born to single mothers. There is an absence of fathers that is across the landscape, at least 2 generations deep. Instead, we have baby daddies, and I've talked to kids who could say, well, that's the baby daddy for this one of my sisters and brothers, and that's the baby daddy for that one. But marriage is not a common thing to find in the inner city. 53% of the Hispanics are having children out of wedlock now, and 66% of the Native Americans. This isn't a moral indictment. I'm saying culturally, it makes it impossible to pass on civilization. A single mother has her hands full just trying to work to near minimum wage jobs to keep food on the table. It's an impossible situation. But what happens is that the children of unmarried mothers are, statistically speaking, much more likely to use drugs. They are more likely to do poorly in school. And by the way, the Catholic Church is pulling out of the inner cities. That was the last front, if you will, for civilization. Children like this are also more likely to end up in prison themselves and have their own children out of wedlock. Now, the men in the inner city, many of them that I've encountered, are caught in this crossfire. So they're caught in inadequate schooling. They turn to the one lucrative form of business, which is drug trafficking. If you're a 10-year-old kid and you can earn $300 a day just for running a little bag across a park, that's pretty good money in the inner city, and it's very hard to resist that. So the men who are there are in this cycle. So there is lack of education, so they turn to using drugs and often to selling it. Then they're arrested and put into prison. And then when they get out eventually, the only people they know are in that neighborhood again, and the only marketable skill they have is in drug trafficking, and they do the one rational thing, which is to go back to that. So you have this cycle of incarceration and then coming out again, still the same lack of skills, and by the way, try applying for a job if you check the felony box in your application, not so easy. So we end up with this cycle, and it is almost impossible to get out of it on their own. So far, no one has found a really good solution to address all of those issues at once. Another one of my mentors that I encountered along the way is a man named Bob Woodson. He is African American. He did sociological studies. He got the Genius MacArthur Award, but he specialized in going into the inner city and finding what he called the grassroots leaders. And he understands something that I've learned the hard way, is that you can't go into a plan into a neighborhood and expect other people to get on board with your vision. The only intelligent thing to do, Bob Woodson says, is ask them what they think they need and find the people who live in that neighborhood to actually then lead the efforts to bring together neighbors into a sense of community and accomplish what they have self-identified as necessary. Well, that's a risky thing to try, too. Another one along the way that I met, who I would highly recommend, Byron Johnson began to do sociological studies on what he called the faith factor. So we have the premise that, of course, people of faith would have a better life. Well, is that statistically verifiable? And the answer is yes. Byron Johnson found, for example, that teenage males in the inner city who attend church at least once a week, maybe twice, and who self-identify as praying at least once a day, are insulated from the effects of their neighborhood that otherwise would lead them into drugs, gangs, etc. There is a verifiable faith factor that, in a sense, insulates these young people from the deleterious influences around them. Well, that's interesting stuff. So if you then begin to look at the programs that are actually having an impact, to what extent do they have the faith factor integrated into their model? Well, what happens is that there are a variety of attempts, and one of the pastors I talked to in an African American community told me this. There are essentially three kinds of involvement. They're concentric circles. So the outer ring of the concentric circle is stuff. It's money, it's books, it's backpacks, it's whatever it might be. You're dropping off the things that then the ministry can use. And they're good, don't get me wrong. It's good and it's necessary, but there's more. He said the next ring inside is then a one-time event where you actually have a face-to-face encounter with someone, bringing a Thanksgiving turkey and then celebrating the holiday with them, building a Habitat for Humanity house and then talking to the person who's going to be moving into it. But then at the end of the day, everyone goes home and you've had an encounter. Even just a one-day encounter is a better thing, says his pastor, than simply dropping things off. But he said the sweet spot, the really great one, the middle of the target, the bullseye, is a sustained relationship over time with the person whose name you know, and with a relationship of accountability. Much more difficult. If you take on say, a first grader that you're going to mentor and you promise to be there every week for the entire year, you better show up if you've made that promise. But if you do, that relationship transforms a child who doesn't otherwise have anybody reliable in their life. It also accomplishes something that no social program can, no government program can. It uses the medium of love. And love ends up being mutually transforming. It's not only the object of our affections, we find that so much more is taking place in us. And one of the difficulties of looking to the government to solve some of our problems is that the government cannot love. That is the one thing that only the people of God can and should be giving when they are attempting to rehabilitate or spark regrowth in the inner city. Well, after I had studied a great deal of this, I wrote a book about it called Street Saints, wrote another one for philanthropists called Equipping the Saints, and after speaking, and I think I stopped counting after 50, but I think it was almost 60 cities around the country, I came back to Houston and I said, I want to take some of what I've learned and all these amazing, remarkable people and plant it here. So I did my Nehemiah March around the city of Houston. Said, okay, where is the wall down? And we have a very robust nonprofit sector, faith-based groups. This is a buckle of the Bible Belt, so I mean, there are a lot of very well-intended and very active people. But the one place where the homeless shelters stopped or the prison programs stopped was the last piece, which is always implicitly, now go get a job. Well, if you have 4 felonies and you've spent 15 years in prison, yeah, good luck. So I was able to convince, with a kind of a mutual partnership with a number of them, that what we needed to have was an organization that focused on that, specifically on the job piece of it, and put together a program. It looks easy at the beginning. It's a job readiness workshop, 8 days. You think, 8 days of your life, what's that? But actually, there's more. If you do the workshop, then there are 3 months. You get a job search coach who will walk with you personally for as long as it takes. And then if you can stay on one job for 1 year, we have somebody who will help you advance out of the $10.50 an hour job that you have and actually get a little bit higher on the rung, get benefits, and pull your life together. Well, the interesting thing with that is that it is much more successful than we ever could have imagined. And I attribute all of the effectiveness to the fact that it is faith-saturated. God does what man cannot do. The results are this. Now, 10 years later, we've graduated almost 4,000 people, and about 72% of them right now are working today. Now, 60% of these folks had felonies in their background, so I'm not talking about an easy-to-place group, but we also have, college kids who didn't get a job after the first year and then after the second year and have kind of fallen off the radar. All kinds of people who were outsourced, who were downsized, who lost their jobs for a variety. So 40% of our people are what I call more mainstream, but just as devastated. I mean, the absence of work is crippling for the human mind and psyche. Well, one of the reasons that we know we're doing well is that the government counterpart to what we're doing sends us the hard cases they can't do anything with. That's a kind of a success that we are pretty happy about. But the question I think that goes underneath this is, whose job is it to care for the poor? We've operated more recently under the assumption that that is the government's job, but the government can't do it well. And the sad truth is that on the nonprofit sector, with all of these little ragtag groups everywhere, they're impossible to organize in a huge initiative. And they're always scrambling for funds, and they're run on a shoestring and prayer and duct tape. Now, something has to happen to make that different. If you go back to Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, he saw two tendencies in America that make this problem even more acute now. He saw, on the one hand, the tendency toward founding organizations, grassroots kinds of things, which would then be helpful. He said, on the other hand, there is a tendency for Americans to become more materially oriented, to retreat into their own little corner, Tocqueville's words, and to simply have less and less to do with the people around them and just not care. And Tocqueville said as long as these two impulses are balancing each other, the soul of America will remain relatively healthy. He said the minute it tips over toward the material and toward individualism and isolation, the soul of America will become sick. And I think we have probably come to that place. So the answer is building bridges that are then authentic, having the kind of rigor in what we're doing to be accountable, to love people into wholeness, and to give them an opportunity to become all that God intended them to be by not setting the bar too low. And the things that happen, one of the things that happens along the way is that there is this mutual transformation that no one can plan, but we can observe. We celebrate the 8-day workshop with a graduation at the end, and a number of the graduates get up and talk a little bit about their history. And one of them, 3 years ago, Michael Richardson, told us a story. He had lived on the streets all of his life. He was a drug addict who'd been imprisoned many times. His parents had also lived on the street and also were addicts. So we have two generations here. Now, I've seen a lot of people in the inner city at this point, and I'm not too easily intimidated. Michael Richardson was scary. He had scars all over his body, open sores, missing teeth, and a mean demeanor. But somebody had found him under a bridge, convinced him to go to one of the shelters in Houston, and they, in turn, a couple months later, convinced him to come to the Work Faith Connection. And he got up that Friday and he said, I've lived like an animal all my life. I didn't learn to read until I was 45 years old. Everything I know, I learned from people on the street or in prison. But he said, this Thursday here, I found my dignity because you loved me. A lot of us teared up at that moment, but the thing I loved almost the best about it is when he said, because you loved me. He didn't mean me personally. He meant the people on the staff who had been doing it. And that was, for me, the affirmation, I don't have to be there to make it work. They understand how powerful it is to love a person into wholeness with Christ loving through them. And if that could reach Michael Richardson, it can reach anyone. I'll simply close with this. We have this idea that there are the down and outers. Okay, these are the homeless people, these are drug addicts, these are people in and out of prison. Clear to identify. The up and outers, however, are a very interesting subcategory of Americans as well. The up and outers may have more education, they have more PhDs, they drive a BMW, at least they have a car, a whole variety of things. But if you look just this much under the surface, you will find that there are broken marriages, there is alcohol abuse, there's abuse of prescription drugs, there are kids getting into all kinds of bizarre things that we have no idea what they're doing on the internet. And all of a sudden, the people who are now coming to volunteer, we've had thousands of them, the people who were the up and outers, kind of come down a couple notches when they're trying to lift the down and outers up, but the down and outers then can legitimately stand up because their dignity has been affirmed. Someone took the time and the effort to love them into wholeness. And you get the up and outers and the down and outers, and we've discovered that we need the same things. Every single one of us needs a place to live. We need people around us to love us. We need connection with family. But most of all, we need love. And that's where the down and outers and the up and outers converge. And we meet at the foot of the cross. That is where the charitable effort should all be focused. And it's where we personally can engage in a meaningful way, not necessarily because we can solve all the social ills. We can't. But because we're being obedient to what God is calling us to do, and that is to love one another as He has loved us. Thank you.
Well, that wouldn't work. Let's start with a story. I grew up in Chicago in the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s, And when I grew up in the house I grew up in, my family had one telephone. It was yellow, it had a rotary dial, and it was mounted on the wall of my kitchen. Now, I could see there's a number of people in the room know exactly what I'm talking about. Other people are thinking, did I see this in a movie once? Because I'm not sure what he's talking about. Rotary dial, what's that? And we did have concessions to convenience and mobility. I think somewhere along the way, my parents sprung extra for that long coiled cord, so you could actually take the receiver and walk around the corner and sit in the living room for some semblance of privacy. And what's interesting about that, and why I bring it up, is that when the phone rang, one of us would jump up immediately, run to the phone, and we would always answer it on exactly the third ring. Why did we answer it on the third ring? Well, it's because if it went to the fourth ring, we were afraid somebody would hang up, that I wouldn't know who called, what they wanted. Was there an emergency? Did I win a prize? I might miss out. We didn't have caller ID. We didn't have an answering machine. There was no voicemail at the time. And so we had this conditioned response. And I suspect it wasn't just me, it was many of you as well, that when the phone rang, you jumped up, answered it, said hello, who's there? There were exceptions, of course. So sometimes my dad would travel to New York for business, and when he arrived in New York, he would call the house, he would let the phone ring exactly twice, and then hang up. So of course we would never answer on the second ring because it might be my dad calling, and if we picked it up too early, you'd get charged for the long distance toll charge. Because back then, long distance cost a lot of money. You'd get this itemized bill, and you're like, oh my God, you talked for 4 minutes. You know, did you see how much money we spent? And so we had these rituals, these little cultural artifacts that no longer exist, but they were very real as we grew up. And that's interesting to think about that, because think of how much has changed in a number of decades in ways that we could have never have imagined. We no longer differentiate between long distance and local calls. I know a lot of people who live here who have area codes from the cities they moved here from because it no longer matters. That's not something we get charged for. I mean, voicemail, that was an innovation at one point, this miraculous thing called voicemail. I was watching a professor, Scott Galloway from NYU, I think Stern School of Business, talk the other day. He said, if there's one thing you want to do in your life to show people you're an old person, is leave them a voicemail. Because no one else leaves voice. My mom leaves me voicemails. That's the only person I know that will leave me a voicemail. So a lot's changed. And nowadays, many of us, especially my kids, don't even use the phone to talk. It's amazing if I could ever get my kids to talk on the phone because they would prefer so many other alternatives. So my thesis for today is that I believe we are in the beginning stages of a digital revolution. And it's going to both enrich our lives in ways that we can't even begin to imagine, but it's also going to create massive disruption across established enterprises, institutions, and entire communities of people who will be severely, severely disrupted as this change occurs. And I believe that our popular press, our media, what we talk about, sometimes misses the mark because we like to talk about what's exciting and new. So we talk about things like big data, data science. We talk about algorithms, and now artificial intelligence is all the rage. We talk about kids going to school and learning these new technologies because I could get rich once I learn how to do this stuff. But I think that there's another aspect to disruptive change beyond the technology that enables the change, and that's not technological in nature, it's cultural in nature. It's what we do in response to the new technology. How do we behave differently? How do we interact differently? And I think that's where some of the interesting change is going to occur, and is already beginning to occur as we speak. So I want to talk about that. And I think that those changes will be both incredibly disruptive, but also wealth building in ways, and I say wealth building in a very kind of twisted sense of the words, wealth building in a way that maybe I can't measure. Not necessarily economic, but in terms of my lifestyle, how I live, joy I get from my life. So we'll talk about that a little bit. I think we can all agree, though, that one of the things that precipitated this change, and it's not an absolute, because a lot of this stuff is great. It's changed over time. We had the internet, we had computers, we had a lot of changes that have occurred in the past few decades. But if there's one event that I would point to, it's 10 years ago this month, Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. So January 9th, 2007, he gets up at Macworld, announces the iPhone. And when he announced it, I don't believe Steve Jobs even knew what the true future potential of this device would be. Because I quote, he said, "I'm introducing a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device." That's what Steve Jobs envisioned when he launched the phone. He was looking to replace the iPod that people were buying, the phone, that brick of a thing we had that flipped open in our pockets, and maybe give you some access to the internet so you could communicate. And one hint of why that was so is that I recently looked at the image of an iPhone from 2007 for a keynote address that I was preparing in Texas. And when I was looking at the image, I saw something was missing. So, the phone looked different because it had a chrome bezel. It looked old already. It's hard to say, saying that the iPhone looked old, right? But it did. And it had, your phone, your Messenger, and your Gmail and Safari. But the one application that was missing from the initial screen was an application store. So that didn't come with the phone. When they introduced it, they were thinking iPod, telephone, communications device, and they would build these applications for this new device. It wasn't until later, on July 10th, 2008, that Apple allowed people to download the App Store and start getting applications on their phone. And that's what really changed everything, because that's when we went from literally a handful of applications to, I think the latest count is over 1 million applications that are available for mobile technology and devices. And so now that we have all these applications out there, the one thing you could say is that they're generating tremendous amounts of data. These applications track where we go, so they provide companies with location services to identify where I am every minute of the day. They can help track what networks of people I interact with on a personal and a professional level. And they can even track my biomechanics, how fast I'm running, how far I'm riding my bicycle, what's my heartbeat, what's my blood pressure at some point. So this is continually evolving, but all these things are throwing off massive amounts of data. And I think when we think about this stuff, it is natural to think about, big data. That's such a term that's, I think, overused, but we do have big data. We have analytic tools, algorithms to analyze the big data. And in my profession, we use this all the time. And now advanced intelligence is a way of even doing more with this big data to make it alive and bring benefit to you. But I think the other big element that we have to consider is the network effect, that something's changed when we think about an application. So growing up, if I had an application, I might think of something like Microsoft Word on my computer. It's just me and the application and the computer. Assuming the application works like it's advertised, I do something with it, and then it gives me an output. And I think that was true for the majority of applications, even iTunes when it was first introduced, right? You would use iTunes to play your MP3 files. So it just did something for you. But when we say network effect, what's changed, and we'll give you some examples right now, is that we now are in a situation where the application gains power and relevance because millions of other people are using it as well. And once analysts and data scientists can tap into all that information, what the other millions of users are doing, that opens up a whole new world that is extremely disruptive. So I'll give you 3 examples. So one is what I would call the Spotify model. So this is more from an entertainment view. So we think about streaming music services such as Spotify, Pandora, or Apple Music, and it would be justifiable to think of them as a replacement for records, for CDs, for MP3 files. So now I just have all this data and it's streaming to me, so it's a cheaper replacement. And recently Dan Chiasson was writing in the New York Review of Books, and he stated, "This is a new world. Cloud streaming represents a bigger revolution than one brought on by CDs, MP3s, which made music merely cheaper to buy and easier to carry around. Then a person with $10 to spend could have purchased an album. Now, with $10, that same person can subscribe to a streaming service for a month and not only hear that album, but also about 20 million other songs, assuming you have time. So instead of just carrying around or replacing bulky MP3s, what the streaming service has done have given us greater availability of variety. And there's a whole other debate about temporality, that once music was tied to what was common at the time, what I would hear on the radio. Now I could listen to whatever I want. So if I remember that great James Brown song when I was driving home with my dad in 1975, I could bring that up in a heartbeat. And so it's blasting away previous ideas of what we thought were barriers to how music interacted with our lives. But the bigger thing is that what Spotify has done that's really brilliant lately is they've really cracked the code on taking data analytics, understanding what consumers are doing with the data, what songs they're listening to, overlaying that with demographics and other life segment analytics, and then figuring out what is your best curated playlist. And they're getting better and better at this. They recently rolled out Spotify Discover, which every week gives you a curated playlist based on what you've listened to in the past, but then they can seed in songs based on what other listeners like you have listened to and enjoyed listening to. And typically the reaction is, if they get it right. Now, they didn't always get it right initially, but once they figured it out and got the algorithms tuned, you'd be listening to this playlist, you'd hear a brand new song you'd never heard before, and your first reaction would be, wow, this is a great song. I love, what is this? I don't even know these guys. And so it's a sign of how good they're getting at understanding our own needs through this crowdsourced data analytics perspective. And I have to ask the question is this a form of wealth for us as consumers that's very difficult to measure? Because it certainly does increase our satisfaction. You know, our day-to-day life, walking around is now given to a soundtrack that's customized for us. The other model I'll briefly mention is Uber, which we've also mentioned throughout the conference. I'm amazed to hear, I recently read Uber launched their first smartphone app in 2010, Uber Cab. Today the company is valued at $70 billion. It's startling that they could grow that fast in 5 or 6 years. And Uber, in my opinion, is the ultimate solution of sort of the cloud, the ether, right? They don't own any cars. They don't really have that many employees. I think their employee counts around 4,000 and growing, but considering the valuation and revenue of the company, that's a drop in the bucket compared to traditional firms like Hewlett-Packard or Macy's or other large firms that employ hundreds of thousands of people. But what have they done? They've completely changed how we think about transportation. And now they're really focusing on self-driving cars and using advanced intelligence to even replace the driver of the car. And the real reason they're trying to do that is if they can push down the cost per mile of an Uber service to the point where that cost per mile is cheaper than any of us actually owning a car, what incentive do you have to do to drive? Now, there's actually some social good that could come out of that, because they could bring driving ability and mobility to disadvantaged communities who can prior times not afford it, people who have the inability to drive, whether legally or physically. I mean, it does open up a lot of possibilities. But it's also going to be very disruptive, because it can completely change the auto industry as we know it. And I could go on for hours talking about what electrification is about to do to the auto industry, especially in Europe, where we have huge machining unions, but that's another story. But all this is based on data and technology and apps, but the ultimate effect is to change how we behave as consumers. Because I've already had a number of examples where I never would have taken a cab, but now that I had Uber on my phone, I said, oh, I'll see if the Uber is available, and I'll take that instead. So it's really opened up potential, and I think there might be a social good as well. Potentially has also reduced drunk driving deaths, because quickly people will realize I could now have an option to get home safely because I'll just take the Uber instead of driving. Time saved. I don't have to find parking. Yesterday morning, I knew my wife was joining us at the Mass, so I just took an Uber up here. I didn't have to worry about driving around the block looking for a parking spot. And when you guys were trying to move your cars, I was sitting in here having a coffee. It was great. So there are some indirect advantages. And then the third model I'd like to touch on briefly is Amazon. I recently looked back at my purchase history at Amazon, which was really interesting, because I didn't know you could do this until my daughter told me about it. But you could actually go in and year by year see all the things that you bought on Amazon. So I said, well, let's go all the way back and see what happened. My very first purchase was in 1998. I bought a book. It's called the New Jerome Biblical Commentary. And I purchased that book because I had just started my program here at the DSPT. And that year I bought 2 books. I bought that book and I bought another book at Christmas time. But later, something a little bit more portentous happened. In 2002 or 2003, I noticed I bought a toaster. And if you think about what that means, I bought a toaster. Well, it's not just me buying a toaster. It's a lot of people like me buying toasters and appliances on Amazon. And then you look at the current day's news stories. Sears Roebuck Company is a company that I loved going shopping to growing up. They are just dying for air right now, and everyone's waiting, when do they file for bankruptcy? They're on the last legs. Macy's is announcing major layoffs, right? But when people like me started buying toasters on Amazon, how many trips to Macy's never occurred ever again, right? Why would you, when you could just get it online? And then with Amazon Prime, have it at your doorstep in 2 days for no shipping cost. So we're talking about massive changes in commerce, and it's going to have a big effect. Now, this accelerates with digital technology and our phones in our pockets. So in 2013, my family and I moved to Upper Rockridge here in Oakland, close by. And one day, my kids and I were walking down to a local store called the Village Market, which it's a kind of an expensive grocery store, but it's one of those places where it's expensive, but it's a lot easier to get in and out of. So if I want to make a quick trip, I'm going to go there, pay the price, because I'll get home quickly. And on the way out, I noticed this little magazine rack and had a book about my neighborhood called Rockridge. I thought, oh, that sounds really cool. I want to check this book out. So I picked it up, flipped through it. I've got to buy this book. It was $19.99. So I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I don't think I'd ever done this before. I opened the Amazon app that was already on my phone. I typed in the name of the book, and it said you could buy it used for $3.99, and the shipping is free because it's Prime. I hit one click right there as I was looking at the book on the shelf, and 2 days later, it's on my front doorstep. So that local merchant lost that sale, but essentially forever, right? Because I don't need to pay full price if there's this very transparent marketplace out there that allows me access to goods and services. And again, we're seeing that with the news we're seeing in grocery retailing, in durable goods retailing, across the board. Major companies that employ hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people as checkout clerks, stockers, salespersons on the floor, they're all getting hit hard by these massive transformations that are occurring. And I wonder, are these good or bad? Because clearly for me and people like all of us in the room that use these services, they're great because we save money, they're more efficient, I don't have to travel to get my stuff, but at the same time they are very disruptive to large segments of the population. And I also think that things like Amazon have an impact on how we view markets. So, what was once a mass market opportunity for big companies like Procter & Gamble or any of the large companies that sell goods across the country through mass market TV advertising, that's gone because now any firm could come up with a new idea that benefits what you want and other people like you want and market it and distribute it very efficiently through these online channels. That's an existential threat to large companies that produce these products as well. But I want to take it one step further and say, I've kind of talked a little bit about two layers of abstraction here. We got the hardware, right? And that's kind of what we talk about, like, oh, my kids are always on the iPhone, right? And we kind of get seduced by the bright, shiny object. I want the latest upgrade. And we talk about the hardware, but the hardware is only the physical carrier of the applications. So you could also argue that if we take it to that one next level of abstraction and talk about the applications, that's where the real magic happens, right? Because once Apple created this platform, this computing environment, you could start creating these applications that allow people to do things that we literally never could do before. Think of online banking. I can't remember the last time I went to a bank to deposit a check because I could just take a picture of it and I'm done. So things are changing very quickly, but I would also suggest that if we look at those examples like Spotify, Uber, and Amazon, the applications themselves and the platforms they're on, they're transferable too, because it doesn't matter if I'm on Apple's iOS or if I'm on the Android platform and have an LG smartphone. They all still interact, and so what's really going on, I'm thinking about, is what's this process that's changing underneath all of that? What is the new way of doing things that these applications are encoding for us that are affecting us as a society and how we interact with each other? And I think that's where we're going to really see some interesting behavior changes occurring. I purposely spoke about the value or wealth created by these services because it's something that I just started thinking about, and I think it's very hard to quantify. But that's not usually where the conversation begins. We talk about how these disrupt existing enterprises, how many stores selling records or CDs still exist, how many Blockbusters still exist once Netflix was introduced. They don't. And I predict that once the technology is fully sorted out, if we take one market, for example, long-distance trucking, long-distance trucking, I believe, will flip to computer-driven fleets of trucks faster than anyone can anticipate. I think Uber recently purchased Otto, the company that's investigating how to automate truck driving. And the economics are just too strong because truck driving is a high liability business. You're driving long hours, slippery roads, you get in crashes. They always need more efficiency. They want to keep those trucks moving. If they're parked in a rest stop to get a government-mandated night's rest, they're not earning any money. And so by getting rid of regulatory restraints, risk, and increasing efficiency, I think we're going to see a situation in the next decade where potentially 3.5 million truck drivers are out of work. And what effect is that going to have on us as a culture, as a society, and as an economy? And I think there's other things around that, right? Like there's 5 million people that support those truck driving routes. That could be automated in software. So what happens when they lose their jobs? And the ironic thing is that Amazon, I think just the other week, announced they're going to add 100,000 jobs Amazon's going to hire for. And I think there's more than a few people that said that was a little bit opportunistically timed given the new administration and the criticism. But the real question is if Amazon's announcing they're adding 100,000 new jobs, how many hundred thousands of jobs will be eliminated by those new employees? Is it going to be 500,000? Is it going to be 1 million? 2 million? I wouldn't be surprised if any of those estimates have a grain of truth, given that their platform is so efficient compared to our traditional brick and mortar way of delivering goods and services to consumers. So, from my perspective, I've spent the majority of my professional life working in the market research business. One consistent goal, going all the way back to the 1990s, has been trying to move our industry from reporting about what is, observations about what is occurring, to what ought to be done, because that's where the value is, insight. That's always been our goal. Whether I've been running a software design team, working in an advanced and analytic consulting group, or running a large client relationship, we always wanted to move the needle from a commodity, information, to stuff that helps you make decisions, Mr. Businessman, so you can make better decisions and make more money. And as we think about that, working with that data, an example would be price elasticity. I could calculate the price elasticity of an item, and then I could encode that in software so that based on the situation around me, what my competitors are doing, I could automatically tell a client, do I raise or lower the price in order to maximize the sales of my product? Now, I can report that in the past few years, the research industry as a whole has had enormous success in encoding our algorithms into software, building applications that figure this stuff out for our clients, and creating automated systems that make sense of vast treasure troves of data and tell our clients what to do. However, the success is bittersweet. Once the machines were turned on, many of the skilled knowledge workers, even in my own company, that provided insights, discovered that they too had become expendable. Once the machines were turned on and the software started making the decisions, then the highly paid employees who once sifted through all that data became one more cost center that could be optimized, and they too are being eliminated at this very point in time. And once the clients installed the software that helped them optimize their process flow, their supply chain, they too started to see that they could streamline processes and get rid of highly paid white-collar employees. So I thought it was interesting that our discussion yesterday, a lot of people think about the effect of technology as hitting the truck drivers of the world, the hourly employees, but it's not stopping there. It's also hitting the people who are white-collar workers in Fortune 500 companies, and that's happening right now. I've seen it start over the past year and accelerate, so who knows where it's going. So one of my research interests is to look at past changes in information technology for clues to our current situation. I mean, we could talk about the printing revolution, that's the easy one, right? And other people have talked about various changes in industrialization over the past 2 centuries. But I have an intuition, it's a scary intuition, but I have an intuition that as much as we can learn from history in this regard, the changes are going to be much greater and have much more disruptive impact on our society than even our history will inform us about. So we're heading into a whole new world. In an essay entitled In the Depths of the Digital Age, Edward Mendelsohn wrote, "Every technology revolution coincides with changes in what it means to be a human being. In the kinds of psychological borders that divide the inner life from the world outside, the digital revolution suddenly increased the rate and scale of change in almost everyone's lives." Now, I think what he says might be a little bit hyperbolic. From a Christian perspective, I would argue that our humanness is much more consistent than he would claim. But it does go on to illuminate that the dimensions and the magnitude of the disruptions we are about to face, what we've seen in the past 5 years, 10 years is only the beginning, and it's going to accelerate, and we won't have any easy answers. So yesterday, Agnieszka spoke about information versus knowledge versus wisdom, and I thought that was a really nice hierarchy because it fits so well with the topics I'd intended to speak about. And yes, we can build the tools to collect, store, analyze vast stores of data, but the hurdle of wisdom is not so easily overcome. We have the tools to precisely target advertisements for sugar-coated snacks to households with children. That's an easily solved technical problem. It helps just magnify the business decisions for companies that sell those products. But the data cannot answer, the algorithms cannot answer, is that an ethical thing to do? So as we move forward, I think we'll have to really start to understand is how do we as a society and via our government respond to treat disrupted groups of workers in a human way with compassion and sensitivity. Take, for example, the trucking jobs. Are we up to the task of wondering how to help them pay their bills when their jobs disappear? Or will our government's answer be, or society's answer be, just work harder because you should be a self-made man? I don't think that solution is going to solve the problem. And we have to be on guard against demoralizing and corrosive messages from our culture, whether it's a gospel of prosperity, or as other commentators have spoken about today, fringe free market thinking that will do nothing to solve for large swaths of the population that are being disrupted and have no clue as to what to do next, considering that's been their entire life. Arthur C. Clarke said, "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And for all the capabilities our technology brings, it would be reasonable to assume that human-centered questions of meaning, morality, and purpose have not gone away. I believe, as I expect you do too, the Catholic imagination, our broad witness and experience across the world, and our rich tradition of philosophical and theological engagement uniquely prepares us as leaders to identify emerging issues of critical import and formulate answers that will help us as a society to responsibly both benefit from this new technology, as we will, but also support those whose lives have been disruptive. And all I would leave us with is the thought that the complexity is deeper than I think any of us imagine, especially reading the popular press about what's going on. And I think the urgency is greater than we can ever imagine. Once these changes hit, and I predict in the next 5 to 8 years, we're going to see them hitting faster and harder than we ever thought, there will be a great deal of urgency to create solutions, and it will be upon us to lead the way in terms of providing guidance to help our policymakers make the best decisions. So thank you.